Joe Rogan raises red flags for Millennial and Gen Z women, according to Change Research polling firm. More than half of women 18 to 34 years old are alarmed if their partner tunes in to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast.
The survey of 1,000 females also found that 53% were off-put if their partners refused to see the summer blockbuster, the Barbie movie. At risk of sounding like a pick-me here, I have the exact opposite reaction to both of those things. I wouldn't say that listening to Joe Rogan is necessarily a turn-on, but it definitely doesn't bother me. My fiance listens to interviews on there all the time. I do think maybe being a religious listener where you just parrot everything Joe Rogan says is maybe a little bit concerning, but I feel that way about any media that a person consumes. And honestly, I would have felt weird seeing the Barbie movie with my fiance. I just don't think that would have worked. For me, that's the girly pops that need to go see Barbie together.
Yeah, I think this exposes the importance of how a polling question is worded, because I think sometimes when anyone hears, oh, they're a Joe Rogan Experience podcast listener, they imagine his extreme fans. When I think about they won't tune in to the Barbie movie, to me, it's not just they didn't choose to see it. That really makes it sound like they hate it. They talk about how much they don't want to see it and how bad it is. I think the interesting thing about this poll as well is that 76% of women said that it would be a red flag if someone identified as a MAGA Republican. Now, I don't think that it would be a Make America Great Again red flag. I think that means they would not be interested in dating the person if they were a MAGA Republican. 76% is a really, really big number there. So we know that pretty homogeneously Gen Z is progressive, millennials are more progressive than other generations. But it's interesting to see how this plays out across genders, across men and women, just the responses on this poll. Talking about politics frequently, they asked about astrology on that front. Only 20% of women said that was a red flag, whereas 41% of men said that was a red flag. And then saying all lives matter and Black lives matter was another really interesting response. 60% of women said a guy saying all lives matter would be a red flag, whereas 41% of men said so. And then Black lives matter. 14% of women said that was a red flag. 33% of men said it was a red flag. So the differentials there are very interesting.
Yeah, we hear traditionally that men are more open to dating a woman who has opposite political beliefs than women are dating a man who has opposite political beliefs from them. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, whether it's men are just looking for different data points, I guess, when evaluating whether a woman's going to be a good partner. And I do think politics can sometimes speak to underlying values, but that's not necessarily always the case. But I think what's concerning about recent surveys we've seen about young people in dating is, especially among adolescent men and women, you see that men are becoming more conservative, whereas women are becoming more progressive, more liberal. So if you do have a case where there's an increasing mismatch on politics, and one group of people says they don't want to date people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum, what does that mean for matching and pairing? What does that mean for marriage rates and down the line birth rates for the younger millennial and Gen Z generation? Are they going to have a hard time getting into healthy, long-lasting relationships? And what does that mean for our society as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. When we see political polarization reach the extreme to where, if a couple meets and they're on their first date and they're talking about politics for whatever reason, I think, maybe millennials and Gen Z are more open to doing so than older generations. But let's say you're talking about politics. It seems to me that the conversations are usually centered around pretty surface level issues without getting to the heart of the issue, which is, what are your values and why did you ultimately arrive at that conclusion? I think being on the same page when it comes to morals, ethics, and values is more important than agreeing on political issues on the surface or whether or not you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. I think you made a good point, Amber, in saying, people can tune into the podcast because he has really lengthy interviews with his guests, and you might be interested in the guest. So I really think people need to talk more. And the main problem here is just dismissing people at the surface level, dismissing after you hear they listen to Joe Rogan, dismissing after you hear something that seems like it might not be aligned with your political faction. There's a lot of that. And I wouldn't even call it cancel culture. I'd just call it dismissiveness.
Yeah, exactly. There seems to be a sort of rejection of a culture of free expression and free speech among a lot of Gen Z people. When you poll them, they have much higher rates than previous generations of being willing to shut down speakers that they disagree with. They think that hate speech should be illegal, and they generally don't have any interest in having real conversations with people on the other side of the political spectrum, which only increases the divisiveness that we're talking about. I also was thinking about, as we looked at this poll, of the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago regarding Tim Pool and his panel's comments about women with high body counts and whether or not they should be shamed. And it's kind of made me think that there's kind of a political component to that, because if a female generation is becoming more liberal, they're presumably also becoming more open on issues of sex and more, I guess, from a feminist perspective, of sex being a tool for empowerment. And if men are becoming more conservative, they're going to be less likely to view women who do have that view on sex as being attractive partners, particularly for marriage. And so this only further contributes to this divide and this potential for this generation to have some of the lowest partnership and marriage rates in history.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, especially when we had for such a long time a lot of pop culture and the dominant culture in media be men being hypersexualized, essentially. You know, the sexualization of women, of course, sort of talking about them like they're objects, wanting to see them in skimpy clothes, you know, rap music about things like this, rock music about things like this, and men being these beings that are always sexual, but holding women to a different sort of a standard. I think if the behavior changes along with the political views among men, I would be more sympathetic of that view. I think the problem with the Tim Pool crowd is that they still expect men to be these promiscuous beings. Andrew Tate is definitely one of the people that holds this view, but women need to be more conservative in the way they operate in that sphere. To me, that feels really hypocritical. And so I'd like to see more across the board thinking there. But it might push more women away if men have this double standard for themselves when it comes to the judgment of their sex lives and their behavior in that way. I think another element of it is the changing views on gender and seeing the disparity in who would say that there's more than two genders here. 58% of women saying that it would be a red flag if they said there are only two genders, whereas men said only 34% of them said that it would be a red flag if their partner said there are only two genders. That's an interesting one as well. Just the difference in views on transgenderism in the United States.
Yeah, I guess I'm not super surprised to hear that. I mean, there's been some cases even where members of the transgender activist community have accused men of being transphobic for not wanting to date transgender women who are biological men and still have male genitalia. And I think that really hurts their movement, trying to make that argument. And perhaps men in particular feel quite attacked by that sentiment. That's going to do it for us with this edition of Rising Fridays. Jess, it was great to be with you again.
Another good week, back with Blue Collar Fridays, the two of us together.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next week.
Bye, y'all.